She has been a duchess for exactly 4 hours, and in 4 hours she has already won. The great withdrawing room of Ashveil Park holds 30 people, and not one of them is breathing quite right. The candles are too low. She trimmed them herself 3 hours before the guests arrived, telling the housekeeper the others were too tall for the arrangement, smiling pleasantly, meaning every word of a different sentence entirely. The wax has been running for an hour, small pale tracks down the silver holders. Nobody has mentioned it. Cecilia Margaret Rowe, née Holt, Duchess of Ashveil, stands at the centre of the room with a champagne coupe in her gloved hand and her spine so straight it looks architectural. Her ivory gown is immaculate, her face is composed. She is smiling, a smile that does not reach her eyes, but does not need to, because it has reached every corner of the room, and the room has gone very quiet around it. Across from her stands Edmund James Rowe, her husband of 4 hours. His jaw is set. His eyes are the colour of winter water. In his hand there is a letter, one letter, folded open. He has just finished reading it. Everyone can tell, because he has gone very still in the way that men go still when the ground shifts beneath their feet, and they have not yet decided whether to stand or fall. The letter was placed in his study 3 days before the wedding, by his wife, by the woman now watching him read it with a smile that is, if you look closely enough, the most frightening thing in the room. She has been waiting 2 years for this moment. Her hands are trembling slightly inside the white gloves, not from fear, from the sheer effort of not letting the victory fully arrive on her face before she is ready. You do not yet know who she was before she became his duchess. You do not know what is in that letter, or what it cost her to place it there, or how many nights she sat with a small leather notebook and wrote a single sentence by candlelight and crossed it out again by morning. You see a woman at the centre of a frozen room and a man holding paper that has just changed everything, and you assume, the way everyone in this story assumes, that you understand what you are looking at. You don't, not yet. Before I take you back to where this began, I want to say something to those of you who are new here. Whispered Thrones exists for exactly the kind of woman this story is about, the kind who is underestimated, outmaneuvered, overlooked, and who finds in the end that she was always the most dangerous person in the room. If that sounds like your kind of story, subscribe. You belong here, and if you have been here a while, you already know what is coming now. Let me take you back to where this began. Her name, before everything else, was Cecilia Holt. She was 24 years old, the daughter of a gentleman, and she was living in the spring of 1814 in a state of careful, invisible humiliation she had learned to wear so smoothly that most people never noticed it was there. The house she lived in belonged to a distant cousin, by marriage, named Lady Fairbra. It was a good house in Grosvenor Square, with high ceilings, and a staff trained to treat Lady Fairbria's companion the way one treats a piece of furniture one is rather fond of, but would not grieve over losing. Cecilia had her own room. She was expected at meals when Lady Fairbria required an audience and absent when she required company of a different kind. This was charity. Lady Fairbria reminded her of it in the small, constant ways that are more effective than ever saying the word aloud. 2 years before this spring, Cecilia's father had died. He was a kind man, impractical in the way of men who trust the world to be roughly as honest as they are. He had a small estate in Wiltshire, not grand but his, and he loved it the way he loved everything, steadily, without drama. He had invested the family's modest capital in what appeared to be a sound scheme. Land certificates, Derbyshire properties, projected returns presented by respectable men with respectable names. The scheme collapsed progressively, the way a house settles into bad ground. The certificates, examined more carefully, described land that did not exist in the configurations promised. By the time the fraud became clear, the money was gone, and the principal architect was also gone. The previous Duke of Ashveil, who had died of a liver complaint, having lived very well in the interval between collecting investment money and the world noticing something was wrong. Her father did not survive the ruin. It was a lung complaint that killed him, technically, but Cecilia knew, in the way that daughters know things, that it was the loss of the land that took him first. He died believing no one would ever come for them. She had not cried at his bedside. She sat very still and held his hand and memorized his face. And when she left the room, she went to the writing desk in the corridor and began making a list. Names, documents she needed, what exactly she intended to do. Her father's solicitor, a careful, dry man named Featherstone, had spent 6 months examining the investment papers and concluded that the falsifications bore the hallmarks of legal preparation, not amateur fraud. Someone with access to proper conveyancing language had written these documents. Someone who knew which details would reassure a provincial gentleman, and which questions he would not think to ask. Cecilia spent the next year learning everything she could about the Ashveil estates, the Rowe family accounts, and the name of their solicitor. She did this the way a woman in her position must do everything she cannot do openly, indirectly, patiently, through conversations that seemed to be about other things and documents accessible in reading rooms, if one were willing to spend an afternoon asking the right questions of the right clerks. Every evening before she slept, she opened a small leather notebook and wrote one sentence. A sentence she intended to say, someday, in a room with the Duke of Ashveil. The sentences changed as her understanding deepened. Some were angry, some were legal and precise. Some, in the early months, were grief-coloured and raw, and those she crossed out without reading again. Over time they got quieter, calmer, more specific. The notebook, by the spring of 1814, was almost full. The instrument of her plan was Edmund Rowe, who had inherited the title and the fortune and the estates, and, presumably, the records of how they had been built. He was 32, the kind of man who makes a room rearrange itself when he enters, not through charm but through the gravitational quality of someone who has never been uncertain about his right to be exactly where he is. He sat on 2 parliamentary committees. He controlled land across Derbyshire and Northumberland. If he refused to acknowledge you publicly, certain doors closed, and they did so quietly you might not notice for a week. He was introduced at a men's club in London in March of that year, refusing to be enthusiastic. A business associate presented an investment plan with great energy. Edmund listened with the expression of a man counting ceiling tiles, then set down his glass and said, with perfect quietness, "My family does not involve itself in schemes that require enthusiasm to be convincing." He stood. He left. He needed a wife, and he was approaching this the way he approached all practical necessities, with efficiency and at arm's length. He had delegated the matter to his solicitor, a thin, meticulous man named Harwick, who had served the Ashveil estates for 15 years, and who had been urging the necessity of a duchess with the measured persistence of someone who had very good reasons for wanting the household to remain stable and unexamined. What Edmund had in the back of a locked drawer in his study was a private ledger his father had kept. He had found it 2 years ago, during an inventory after his father's death. He had opened it to the first 3 pages. He had felt something cold move through him, not dramatic, just suddenly present, and he had closed the ledger and locked the drawer, and told himself he would address it properly when he had more time. He had not made the time, and somewhere in Wiltshire, on a piece of land that used to belong to a man named Holt, the grass grew the way it always had, and no one was looking at it. The Pemberton Musicale in Grosvenor Square was not the kind of event Cecilia would have chosen to attend if attendance had been a matter of choice. She was there because Lady Fairbriear wished to go, and she was there in the capacity she occupied at all such events, slightly behind, and to the right of her employer, her function being to fetch things and agree with things, and be, in all practical senses, invisible. The room held 60 guests in neat rows. A string quartet had arranged itself at the front with the air of musicians on excellent terms with their programme. Lord Pemberton's daughter sat in the front row, wearing careful attentiveness, clearly maintained for the benefit of someone specific. That someone was Edmund Rowe, who had arrived with Horrocks, and taken a seat at the edge of the room with the composure of a man attending a parliamentary session of little consequence. When the quartet began the second movement of the Haydn, Cecilia forgot for a moment to be invisible. It was barely anything, a small breath, the involuntary response of someone who loves music and has heard it for a moment as itself, rather than as social backdrop. She caught it almost immediately, but not quite immediately enough. Edmund turned his head, not dramatically, just turned, and looked at her for perhaps 2 seconds, the way you look at something that doesn't fit the pattern. Then he looked away. She spent the next 20 minutes being invisible with considerably more concentration. The problem was what she had seen. She had constructed over 2 years a version of Edmund Rowe that was coherent and useful, the son of a thief, the inheritor of a corrupt fortune, a man who would not look too closely at things because looking too closely did not suit his comfort. That construction still stood, but the man 6 rows ahead of her was perceptive and controlled, and she recognized, with a sinking feeling in her chest, that he would be harder than she had planned. Not because he was cruel, because he wasn't. When Lord Pemberton made the brief introductions, companions are acknowledged rather than presented. Edmund looked at her for 3 seconds, gave a nod, and returned his attention to Miss Pemberton. Near the end of the evening, fetching Lady Fairbriar's shawl, Cecilia passed close enough to hear Edmund speaking to Harwick. She would need to be manageable, he said, practical rather than unkind. Quiet, undemanding of my time. She straightened. She walked back to Lady Fairbriar. Then, once, just once, she let herself look at Edmund Rowe directly across the room, just for a breath, just long enough to think, yes, that is exactly what I will be. She was making her approach carefully, engineering proximity through Lady Fairbriar's engagements, cultivating the right visibility in the right rooms. When the complication arrived, a woman she knew slightly mentioned at cards that Harwick had compiled a short list of potential wives. 3 names. Miss Dorothea Vane was the leading candidate, a baronet's daughter with parliamentary connections that complemented Ashveil's committee interests precisely. Harwick was preparing a formal approach within the fortnight. 2 weeks. That was all she had. Her plan had depended on gradual cultivation. She did not have weeks. She had a fortnight, at the end of which Edmund would be formally committed to someone else, and a companion from Grosvenor Square would have no further access to him. She had to be conspicuous, noticed immediately for the right reasons, without appearing to try, because appearing to try would invite exactly the scrutiny she could not afford. The dinner in Mayfair was small, 14 guests, a house with Derbyshire connections, Cecilia there by virtue of Lady Fairbriar's acquaintance with the hostess. The arrangement was not accidental. It was the result of 3 careful conversations and 1 well-placed suggestion. She had positioned herself, over the course of the evening, near a conversation about estate management, and she said something precise and specific about drainage law on Derbyshire properties, something she had spent 6 months studying precisely for a moment like this one. Edmund stopped. He looked at her, not the 2-second categorization of the musicale, but something longer. He asked a question, she answered. He asked another. 11 minutes later, she could see that the description of her, furniture, wallpaper, a chair that requires nothing, had cracked slightly around the edges. It was what she had planned. What she had not planned was what happened in the hall. She was waiting for Lady Fairbriar's carriage when Harwick appeared at her shoulder, arriving the way cold draughts arrive. Without announcement, suddenly just there. "Miss Holt," he said quietly, "I know who your father was." She did not move. "And I know why you have been making yourself visible to his grace." He knew. Not the documents, not the ledger. But he knew her father was Holt of Wiltshire, and he knew the Ashveil connection to the scheme, because Harwick himself had drawn up several of the fraudulent documents 15 years ago on the previous Duke's instruction. He was the legal mechanism through which the old Duke's fraud had operated. He had spent 15 years in quiet, successful concealment, expecting, if anyone came looking, that they would come with a solicitor or a creditor's letter. He had not expected a young woman in her employer's second-best dress, waiting for a carriage. She understood, standing in that hall, that Harwick's urgency about Edmund's marriage, his management of the shortlist, his preference for a duchess who would be manageable, all of it had a second meaning. He did not want Edmund settled. He wanted the accounts undisturbed. He wanted no one to open the things that should not be opened. She said evenly, "Good evening, Mr. Harwick." She smiled. She walked out to the carriage. The campaign against her began the following week. Not loudly, a word at cards, a mention of the late Mr. Holt's checkered financial history, the slow and deliberate closing of certain drawing-room doors. Nothing specific, nothing she could confront. She noticed, she said nothing. Then Edmund sent a note to a Friday hostess. He would be bringing Miss Vane as his guest of honour. Lady Fairbriar mentioned it to Cecilia at breakfast with tactless brightness. Edmund had made no cruel decision. He barely knew Cecilia existed as a person with an interior, but the effect was the same as a door closing in her face. That evening, she permitted herself 1 full minute of something in the family of grief. Then she picked up the notebook. Harwick came to her again. He presented, in a brief exchange at the edge of a drawing-room, a card with a sum written on it, enough to clear her from Lady Fairbriar's house, enough for a modest independent income. In exchange, the documents, all of them, a dignified exit. She held the card for a long time. She was tired in ways she had not allowed herself to fully measure, tired of being careful, tired of being poor, tired of 2 years of crossed-out sentences. It would have been enough, genuinely enough. She handed the card back. "My father," she said quietly, "died believing no one would ever come for them. I intend to prove him wrong." She left. Harwick watched her go with something that might have been respect, and was definitely fear. Now I want to pause, because we are at the moment in this story where everything is about to shift. You have watched Cecilia position herself in rooms full of people who cannot see her clearly. You know what she is carrying. You know what is in that locked drawer in Derbyshire. What you are about to discover is what happens when 2 people who have been avoiding the same truth walk into the same room with it at the same time. And one of them has been waiting for this moment for 2 years. Stay with me. The country party at Ashveil Park was Harwick's idea, organised to advance the Vane introduction. Cecilia had been included because Lady Fairbriar had been included, and Lady Fairbriar went where there was company. This was, if Harwick had thought about it more carefully, a significant error. He had concluded, incorrectly, that Cecilia, having been subjected to weeks of social attrition, had either abandoned her plan or lacked the time to act on it. She had exactly the time she needed. The house was large and cold, in the way of houses built to impress rather than inhabit. Ceilings were very high. Cecilia had committed the floor plan to memory in the first 6 hours. Edmund's study was on the 2nd floor, east wing. She had researched the layout of Ashveil Park in the same way she had researched everything else, patiently, specifically, and with the absolute refusal to consider any detail irrelevant. She went there on the third afternoon, while Lady Fairbriar rested and the other guests walked the grounds. She was looking for a specific conveyance record she believed should be in the general estate papers. She found the papers, she did not find the document. What she found in a locked drawer at the base of the desk was a ledger, small, private. The handwriting on the cover was not Edmund's. The lock took her just under 3 minutes. She opened it. There was her father's name. Not yet as a victim, as a creditor, a reliable source. One entry in a list of provincial gentlemen whose trust had been useful and whose accounts had been carefully managed. The handwriting described it all with the calm of someone writing for private purposes. How the certificates had been structured, which solicitor had formalized which documents, how the early returns had been managed to maintain confidence. Everything. 2 years of gathering from the outside, written from the inside, in the late Duke's own hand. She turned to the front page. She saw the date. She saw the notation in a different hand. Edmund's, confirming receipt of the private papers after his father's death. She saw the particular wear on the first pages, the slight softening of the edges, the way paper looks when it has been handled and then returned and not touched since. He had been here. He had read these pages. He had felt the cold thing move through him. She could almost feel it herself. The moment when the records stop being ambiguous and become simply clear. And he had locked the drawer. He had locked the drawer and returned to his parliamentary committees and his 12 years of impeccable reputation. And he had told himself. She understood this, sitting in the cold study with his father's handwriting in her hands, that he would address it when he had more time. That certainty required more time than he currently possessed. He had been sitting on certainty for 2 years. She gathered her own documents from her coat pocket and laid them beside the ledger on the desk. She thought about all the sentences she had written and crossed out. She thought about the one she had written the previous night and not yet crossed out. Then she took the ledger, left the documents on the desk, went to the library, lit one lamp and waited. He found her there 2 hours later. The other guests had retired. The house was quiet in the way of large houses, not silence but the sounds of settling and distance. He had gone to his study first. She knew that because of the 7 minutes between the sound of his footsteps on the stairs and the sound of the library door. She did not turn when he came in. She was sitting at the table with the ledger open in front of her and her own documents arranged beside it. And she looked exactly like a woman who has been waiting for this precise moment for a very long time. She heard him stop. She heard him see what was on the table. She turned then. "I have been waiting 2 years to be in this room with you." Her voice was steady. She had written sentences for this moment every night for 2 years. This one came from somewhere below the notebook. "I want you to know that before I say anything else." He was standing near the door. His face was the face of someone who has walked into something he cannot immediately calculate. "Sit down, Your Grace, please." "Not because I am giving you an order. Because what I am about to tell you will be easier if you are not looking down at me while I tell it." He sat. She told him everything, not as an accusation, as a report. Her father's name, Thomas Holt, of Wiltshire, the investment scheme, the land certificates and their false descriptions, the amount lost, the date her father began declining, the date he died. She told it plainly, the way a woman tells a thing she has rehearsed every night for 2 years, and when she finished, she placed her documents on the table and folded her hands. "I married you because your name gave me the right to be in this room. Because a duchess can petition Parliament where a companion cannot. Because you were the only door left open to me. That is why you chose me, because I would be manageable, undemanding, quiet. And I was all of those things. I was exactly what you needed." A pause. I simply needed something too. She looked at the ledger. Your father's ledger is already open on the table. You will notice I did not bring it to you. You already knew it was there. The room was very still. Edmund said nothing for a long time. The lamp threw a small circle of warmth that reached the documents and both of their hands and not much else. Finally, how long have you known about the ledger? 3 hours. Something moved through his face. Not quite any single thing. Why didn't you take it and go? She stood. She did not leave. She walked to the window and stood with her back to him, looking out at the dark grounds of Ashveil Park. Grounds built, in part, from her father's money, from the reliable trust of men who had believed the men they were dealing with were the sort one could trust. Because taking it and going was never the plan, she said. The plan was for you to open it yourself. She heard him pick up the ledger. She heard the pages turn. She did not watch him. She had waited 2 years. She could wait another hour. She stood at the window and listened to him read, and thought about her father's face, and about the notebook, and about the sentence she had written the previous night, and not yet crossed out. And outside, the dark grounds of Ashveil Park were very still, the way things are still just before they change. He read for a long time. She did not watch him. She had waited 2 years. She could wait another hour. By morning, Edmund understood completely. He understood the structure and the scope, the names of the men who had administered it. He understood that Harwick was not merely his solicitor, but the legal instrument through which the fraud had been maintained for 15 years. He summoned Harwick. He laid the documentation before him. He was quiet in the way he was always quiet, the way that required no raised voice because rooms rearranged themselves around him regardless. And he told Harwick what was going to happen. A full accounting, every fraudulent transaction, every investor, every amount, witnessed. Documented, not buried. The accounting took months, unglamorous, expensive, slow. Edmund lost 2 parliamentary allies, men whose families had also benefited from the scheme and wished it to remain unexamined. He did not accommodate them. What he lost was the ease of unquestioned power. What he gained was harder to name. A way of inhabiting his own life that felt, for the first time, like it fit. Harwick's name appeared in the accounting as the legal administrator of the scheme. He left London. He was not prosecuted. The law offered no clean mechanism, and Edmund would not manufacture one. The ledger, simply being read in full and entered into record, was enough. What Harwick lost was the only thing he had valued, the ability to continue. Cecilia burned the notebook in the library fireplace one morning in early autumn. She did it alone, without ceremony. She watched the pages take the flame and thought about her father's face. She had needed almost all of it. She did not need it any more. The record now said what it needed to say. Her father was listed not as a failed speculator, but as an investor who had been deliberately defrauded. A victim, a man who had been robbed. He had not failed. He had been robbed. There was an extraordinary difference, and she had made the record show it. And her hands were shaking slightly when she stepped back from the fireplace. Not from grief, but from the particular feeling of having set down something very heavy, and finding that your arms still remember the weight. Edmund came to find her at the window of her sitting room on a late autumn afternoon, the south-facing light coming through the glass at the angle she had chosen this room for. She was reading a letter from the Parliamentary Committee confirming that the petition for formal restitution to the families of identified investors had been accepted. It was not the dramatic reckoning she had imagined at 22, writing sentences in a notebook by lamplight. It was better than that. It was real. She held the letter up without turning, and after a moment she felt him step close enough to read it over her shoulder. They stood like that, both of them reading the same words, neither of them speaking, and outside, the Derbyshire light was the pale gold of early autumn. She had come here to win. She had not planned to stay, and yet here she was, and here he was. And the ledger was closed, and the window was open, and somewhere in Wiltshire, on a piece of land with her father's name on the deed, the grass was growing the way it always had. This story was never really about a marriage. It was about a woman who refused to let a wrong be buried, who wore a smile at the right moment, who waited, who planned, who spoke only when the room was ready to hear. Cecilia Holt did not ask for justice, she arranged it. And that is the thing this story gave you, if you let it, not the fantasy of being rescued, but the far more satisfying truth that the most dangerous person in any room is often the one everyone forgot to watch. If this story moved you, if you recognized something in Cecilia's patience, in her notebook full of senses, she was waiting to say, then you belong here. Subscribe if you haven't. Come back for the next one. And if you have been listening all this time and still haven't subscribed, well, Cecilia waited 2 years. I think you can manage one button. She came to Ashveil Park to burn something down. She stayed because what grew back was better. Go back to the beginning if you like. To that candlelit room, to that smile, to 4 hours of being a duchess and already having won. You know now what she knew then, and knowing changes everything.